if you're surrounding yourself with people who are intentional about their marriage, who are good parents, you're more likely to be a good spouse and a good parent. Recognize and realize that it's much more than feelings, much more than butterflies in the stomach. Marriage is about commitment, about kids, about cash, and about kin.
Welcome to the show today. You're in the right place because we are in our second and sadly last show of the mini series that I'm calling Society Check-In. It's a check-in to find out what's going on in culture, what we need to know, how do we need to educate ourselves so we can lead effectively in our work, in the world, with our families, with the people in the community. This episode is going to be so fascinating. This is one that you're going to want to share over and over again. I have Brad Wilcox with me, and we're diving into what the research says. Now, this is research without an agenda, says about families and marriage. We learned about luxury beliefs last week with Rob Henderson, and this ties into those luxury beliefs perfectly. We're going to dive into the data. We're going to dive into what it means. It is a quick episode that I think you're going to love. Like I said, this is one that you're going to want to share with a lot of people. And after we talk with Brad, it's time for coaching, of course. Today, I am giving you how to begin making progress when you feel stuck with something. In the final segment of the show today, I'm bringing you a story about my life and a recommendation for how you can make your day-to-day life just a little bit easier. So without further ado, here's my new friend, Brad. Brad, welcome to the show. I've been so excited to have you on. I love your book, Get Married. What a great title. Before we dive into marriage specifically, I want you to talk about a little bit of research that shows what types of people are the happiest, because this is really interesting from marital status to political views. It is so interesting to see what research says about who's happiest in America right now.
Yeah, so Allie, one of the things that I find in the book is that kind of that classic American pursuit, what Jefferson called the pursuit of happiness, is kind of more likely today to be realized among college-educated Americans, religious Americans, and conservative Americans. Those three groups are more likely to report that they're happy with their lives. And that, of course, brings us back to marriage, as I'm sure you can tell from reading the book.
Yeah, once I read the survey research and kind of went into what people are reporting about their lives, it was really, really interesting because it's definitely not what we see in popular culture.
Right.
Hollywood shows that marriage is a trap and having kids, is just going to destroy your happiness. And conservatives, this isn't a political show, of course, but conservatives are all angry and miserable about, X, Y, or Z. But when you look at the data, these groups of people are pretty happy.
Yeah, and so I think part of the challenge, obviously, is realizing that what you see on TV and what's going on in Washington, D.C. is not really kind of representative of what's happening in the broader culture. Women, for instance, who are married and who are mothers, ages 18 to 55, are the happiest group of women out there. They're almost twice as likely to be, very happy with their lives compared to their single and childless peers. And it's roughly the same story for married fathers compared to guys who are not married as well. So, kind of despite the fact that there are just literally dozens of articles in mainstream publications talking down marriage and parenthood, especially marriage and motherhood, what we see is that in kind of ordinary American households, it's married moms who are doing the best for women and married dads who are doing the best among men.
We had Rob Henderson on the show last week, and he was talking about luxury beliefs, this concept that it's really the elites in culture are pushing, and Hollywood in culture is pushing, that marriage is so terrible, which is really kind of the elite media that we're reading these articles in the Atlantic and things like that. I want to talk about what's happening kind of broader in culture. It seems like happiness is failing. It seems like people are facing despair. And a lot of Americans feel like the American dream is something that is generations behind. Talk about how marriage plays into these feelings right now, and what's causing this for people.
So I literally live and work in the shadow of Thomas Jefferson. His statue is just, 100 yards from me here at UVA. My home is kind of in the shadow of his home, Monticello. And he obviously is famous for talking about the importance in the Declaration of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And on the life front, we know that deaths of despair have been rising in recent years. We've got a new study from the Institute for Family Studies and Gallup showing that the number one factor in kind of explaining what is driving these deaths of despair is declining marriage rates. When it comes to liberty, one dimension of that is sort of the American dream, rags to riches mobility for poor kids across their lives. And we know from work done at Harvard that, again, the sort of the number one predictor of whether or not poor kids rise in their communities is the share of families that are headed by two-parent, families in their neighborhoods, in their communities. And then on the happiness front, that pursuit of happiness idea, there's just no question that Americans who are married, on average, and we know there are exceptions, are more likely to be happy with their lives. And that the number one factor, this is from a new study at the University of Chicago, the number one factor that helps to unpack why happiness is falling in America in recent decades is, again, this retreat from a marriage that I call the closing of the American heart. So as marriage and family goes, so goes the nation, or as we could sort of say, the state of our union depends upon the state of our unions here in America.
And I think it's really important. We don't want our conversation today, and I know it's not the heart behind your book, to be triggering for people if their marriages have broken up or they're single parents or they've lost a spouse. It's not saying that if you're not married, you can't be happy. If you get divorced, it's going to be terrible for your children automatically. But we want to have this conversation around the fact that we are inundated with this messaging, and our children are inundated with the messaging that marriage doesn't matter, marriage makes you unhappy, that marriage is a net negative for your life. And I think it's really important, the work you're doing. You're not stating your opinions. You're just going through thousands and thousands and thousands of studies saying, this is what I'm seeing. I'd like to hear from you also, and feel free to speak to that, but I'd like to hear from you about the 4 groups that are valuing marriage, and they're doing really well in it right now.
So yeah, it's important to recognize that, plenty of kids like myself, were raised by single moms. I was raised by a single mom, and I think on most outcomes turned out okay. I'm stably employed, I'm married 28 years, got a bunch of kids, I'm happy now. But I'm also a sociologist, and I can tell you that it's harder for kids, like, me when I was a child, to navigate life without the benefit, in my case, of a father in the household. So we just have to be, I think, sensitive to the reality, and that is that kids who are being raised without their married mom and dad in the home are more likely to be struggling. And then at the sort of collective level, whether it's the neighborhoods or the city or the country, the more kids are experiencing family instability, the more likely we are to see problems playing out in schools, safety issues, police, issues, obviously, when there are lots of boys being raised without fathers. So there's a kind of a collective story we have to be sensitive. Well, recognizing that there are plenty of folks, including people like Barack Obama and Jeff Bezos, who were raised, in non-intact families and turned out, obviously, at least professionally, exceedingly well. So that's the complex reality we have to kind of navigate in talking about these issues, but also to kind of point to some positive models out there. And I mentioned before that we see that there are 4 groups today: Asian Americans, religious Americans, college-educated Americans, and conservative Americans who are more likely to be married today, and either more likely to be happily married or stably married. Those 4 groups are as well. So, and to kind of quickly summarize what I find about those 4 groups, and obviously they're different and they're overlapping too. Depends on, I talked to an Indian guy, for instance, who was college educated, who was obviously Asian American, who was religious and conservative, and like by the framework, he's like killing it. In fact, he is killing it. His 3 boys are like, killing it. His wife is killing it. So they're doing great. But what those groups have, I think, often in common is on the cash side, the money side, a good flow of steady income, often a shared asset like a home that they're holding together, and then especially stably employed men. That's a key kind of finding in the book. There's a Harvard study, for instance, showing that when the wife loses her job, no effect on the marriage in terms of marital stability. When the husband loses his job, 33% increase in divorce. It kind of just tells us that having the husband who's kind of gainfully employed, like, and the wife can do what she thinks and what they think is best in terms of home and work. But it seems like for most couples, especially those with kids, having a reliable breadwinner in the picture is key. So that's the cash story. On the culture story, I think recognizing that what I call communion and commitment and community, 3 C's, are really crucial as well. Communion, kind of keeping that spark alive romantically, and I talk about regular date nights as a real help for couples. Religious and more affluent couples are more likely to have those regular date nights. Commitment is key too, recognizing that your marriage matters for you, for your children, even for, I would say, civilization. And Asian Americans, religious Americans, and conservative Americans are more likely to embrace a lot of those commitment norms. Surprisingly, we're seeing a big ideological divide, though. 40 percentage point difference between liberals and conservatives on kind of this idea that it's important to be always faithful in your marriage. And that's kind of a newer thing. Yeah, huge divide there. I'm like, wow. So liberals are not so strong on some of these commitment norms today, unfortunately. That's part of the cultural shift we're seeing play out. And then on the community piece, birds of a feather, Allie, flock together, right? We are our friends. And it's everything from our marriages to our weight, basically. And so if you're surrounding yourself with people who are intentional about their marriage, who are good parents, you're more likely to be a good spouse and a good parent. You're being challenged and encouraged by your peers, either explicitly or implicitly, to kind of be the kind of spouse you should be, the kind of parent you should be. And then I talk about, in terms of that community piece, how religious Americans, church-going, temple, synagogue, folks are more likely to be embedded in social networks where family is valued. Not saying that religious people are perfect. We know they're not. Plenty of cases, obviously. But on average, people who are embedded in their local church are more likely to be happily married, stably married, and to have kids who are doing better on a number of social and emotional fronts.
Okay, I'm fascinated by the research about political divide and faithfulness to a spouse. That is so interesting. I think it's important for us, and you talk about this in the book, and you lay it out with great nuance. But I don't want to go over this too quickly in our conversation. It is so difficult for people in poverty to stay married. It is not only because of government programs and just the pressure of how am I going to pay the bills, the pressure of
Sure.
the community around them. You mentioned social contagion. I know that there's great research. I can't think of it at this moment, but if you have friends that divorce, your X amount more likely potentially to get divorced yourself. Social contagion's a huge thing. So not only are people who are the most vulnerable dealing with just trying to pay the bills, that stress is so difficult on a marriage. Do you have some thoughts about what we can do as communities and maybe even policy shifts that you think we should support to help people who need a leg up and to give families that are struggling the help they need so hopefully they can stay together?
Yeah, so obviously this also comes up probably in your interview with Rob Henderson as well. Kind of, he talks a lot about kind of working class America and how a lot of relationships in working class communities are more fractured and more difficult. And so there's a lot going on there. But I think one of the things we're seeing is that the pop culture is kind of not kind of conveying some, good wisdom to people who might not have good models in their own lives among their own families of origin or their peers as well. And so, kind of more of a short-term mentality, a less committed orientation, to relationships, less stress on fidelity, for instance, in the pop culture. All these things then kind of can reinforce, a lot of the more negative cultural dynamics that we can see in poor working class couples and communities. Obviously not all, but certainly among some, based upon my interviews with working class couples here in Virginia. And I think another thing we're seeing kind of play out for them is that too many young men in those communities are not flourishing both on the home front and in the workplace. So a lot of working class couples that I spoke with had situations where she works more and earns more than he does. And, there are cases where that's fine, right? But what's often happening is he is not making a real effort, or not motivated or not able to work full time. And then she's also doing more when it comes to housework, and if they've got kids, the kids. And so that's just kind of a recipe for a lot of tension and resentment. So I think we have to think about ways to kind of increase young men's orientation to flourishing in high school and or college or a technical school, and then in their early mid-20s, the workplace. So they can kind of like, make their contribution to a dating relationship and a marriage and a family in ways that would be more constructive. So part of that, to answer your question, is we need to do more with our schools to bridge the gender gap. A lot of boys are floundering, a lot of girls are flourishing in our public schools, middle school and high school, even private schools as well. And we've got to be more intentional about building out schools that are more boy-friendly. More single-sex classes, more single-sex schools, more activities that kind of appeal to boys' imagination and minds. These are the kinds of things we need to do to kind of more vocational training and more high-status accorded vocational programs to kind of lift the boys' fortunes and then make them more marriageable. And the public policy front, too, the final thing I'll say is we've got marriage penalties in programs like Medicaid. I talked to 2 couples here in Virginia, same exact situation. They have 2 kids. They're together. They're effectively married, when I spoke with them, but they weren't legally married. In both cases, it was Medicaid. The mom and the 2 kids were on Medicaid. They didn't have access to health insurance at their places of employment. And they knew that if they were to get married and combine their income, report it to the government, they lose access to Medicaid and would blow a huge hole in their budget for every month. So I think we've got to figure out ways to reform our means-tested programs to stop disincentivizing marriage for working class families here in America.
That's great. I think that disincentivizing marriage is such a key thing. And for so many people who are employed and their employer provides health insurance, they don't understand how something like that could be such a big deal.
Right.
But as someone that buys her own health insurance, because I'm self-employed, it's like $3,700 a month. Now, I'm not saying it's like that for all families, but
Sure.
if you're making $15 an hour at a full-time job that doesn't offer benefits or 30 hours, and all of a sudden, if you can't get Medicaid, you have to pay $750 a month or $1,000 a month for health insurance, it's huge because you want to make sure your kids can go to the doctor. So I think it's even for people listening who don't keep up with politics and don't care about X, Y, and Z, it is really important to educate ourselves on this type of thing so we can vote for people who will help solve some of these problems. Because when we have policies that guarantee people will not get married, it hurts families.
Exactly. Yeah, that's fundamental.
I want to give you a couple of things and then just have you say true or false and riff on them for a minute.
Okay.
Ready? Okay, number
Great.
1, in marriage, we should focus on romance.
That's a complicated question. I've got a piece in the journal on this, and Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift. So I would say up to a point, yes, I recommend regular date nights, but recognize and realize that it's much more than feelings, much more than butterflies in the stomach. Marriage is about commitment, about kids, about cash, and about kin. And so you're there, not just for, a good feeling in your stomach or elsewhere, but to be, a good spouse and a good parent and a good son-in-law and daughter-in-law.
Absolutely. I love how you talk about the family first model. Will you talk about that just a little bit as a perspective?
Yeah, so I contrast the soulmate kind of model with the family first model. And the family first model basically is telling us marriage is about more than a feeling. Romance is important, but it's also about kind of being there for your spouse, for your children, for your kin, recognizing that if you kind of are living for others, you're going to have a better financial position typically over the course of your life. And you're going to be relatively more happy because, we are actually kind of hardwired to connect, Allie. And so serving others, being there for others actually makes us happy, whereas kind of just living for our own immediate selfish desires tends to make us miserable.
Yeah, and you talk about this in the book. That's so interesting, kind of talking about that soulmate myth, that when we are always looking for somebody to make us happy and sweep us off of our feet, the Travis and Taylor thing is a great example because how many young people are going to look at that and be like, that's the ultimate love story? Well, maybe, but a real love story is having breakfast together and, wrestling through how we're going to pay the bills and deciding who's on diaper duty. And, it's not all it's not all, the
Right.
feelings in our stomachs and getting excited. And I can't believe I'm so lucky to be with this person. Real love is having somebody understand you and know you and live with you long term.
And I
Second
would
thing,
and I would say,
oh,
just to
go ahead.
quickly jump in here, I think the most powerful expressions of married love often come in late life, right? When,
Yeah.
I know guys here in my community in Charlottesville, wife has dementia. There's no, like, it's not the romance, it's not the butterflies in the stomach. He is caring for his wife in very profound physical ways because he loves her. He recognizes that love is more than a feeling, it's a commitment to will the good of the other.
Yeah.
And so that's, I think, the most powerful expression of married love.
Oh, so good. Okay, second thing, kids will make your marriage miserable. True or false?
False. It's true that they're hard when they first come, and they're hard on many a day. My wife and I have a lot of kids, but in general, what we see is that both men and women who are married parents are the happiest Americans today, and that's because our kids also bring us not just stress and drama, but also a lot of meaning and joy. And I've got one twin who's 14 years old, and almost every night she comes and finds me wherever she is, wherever I am in the house, I should say, and she gives me a kiss either on the forehead or a hug, and that's just you can't replace that, and it's just it's invaluable.
Yeah. Amen to that. Yeah. Kids will drive you crazy, but they'll give you amazing meaning and purpose. And without meaning and purpose in life, there is no joy.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Talk about last thing about teaching kids the success sequence. This is something that I feel like is really important for our kids to wrap their brain around.
Yeah, I think our culture's done a terrible job of kind of educating young adults for the future. We minimize the importance of marriage and love, and like real marriage and real love for them. And now we're even seeing among young men, kind of a lot of young men, as I hinted at earlier, are not working full time, in their 20s, and they're leaving the burden of employment to their girlfriends or their wives. And that's not great for them and for their relationships. So the success sequence basically tells young adults, like in middle school and high school, and then we could talk about it for 20-somethings too, like with PSAs, that there are 3 steps to kind of realizing the American dream today. 1 is getting at least a high school degree. 2 is working full-time in your 20s. And 3 is putting marriage before the baby carriage, getting married before having any kids. And for young adults who do those 3 things, who get that high school degree, who are working, and who get married, their odds of being poor as they head into their late 20s and 30s are just 3%. And their odds of being in the middle class or higher are 86%.
That's just for high school graduates, and not even
Yeah,
college
well,
graduates?
we're including everyone who's kind of at the high school level or higher.
Okay,
So
great.
obviously,
Okay.
more education correlates with more income, and obviously full-time work is a clear predictor of more income as well. But getting married before having kids also elevates your financial, position as well, because when we don't get married, we're not kind of obviously bringing together 2 folks who often have incomes. But also what we're seeing today too is that especially young men tend to work harder and more kind of prudentially when they're married. We know, for instance, that married guys are less likely to be fired than single guys. That's one. And then also if you're moving in and out of households, especially if you've got kids, huge expense. I talked to one guy for the book who had, I think, kids with 3 different women, and every paycheck he gets, about, I think it's like 40% of his paycheck goes to child support. So family instability is expensive as well. So again, kind of getting married, staying married, if you can do it, not everyone can, obviously today, but is a huge financial benefit for ordinary men and women across the country.
That's good. And it's something that when we hear, we go, yeah, that makes perfect sense. But it's something that kids need to be taught over and over and over
And they
again.
don't
This
hear
is
it
the success.
on TikTok and Instagram
No.
and on their Netflix, drama, right? None of this is kind of being conveyed either explicitly or implicitly in a lot of what they're watching and seeing.
And I like having the data behind it because, with teenagers especially, you can tell them something and give them advice and they kind of roll their eyes. But if we have the facts to go, here's the data behind this isn't just my opinion. This is tens and thousands of people. Like this is what research shows. It can give us a little more weight when telling the younger generation.
Yeah, that's right. There was a terrible Bloomberg story that was published when I was finishing up the book that said that basically women who sort of steer clear of marriage and motherhood are richer than women who get married and have kids. And what this Bloomberg story kind of overlooked was that its data was just focusing on singles, so there was no way to kind of actually make a real claim about marriage. Yeah. And the evidence is that married women are much better off financially than single women. For instance, when they are heading towards retirement in their 50s, they got 10 times the assets as their single, never married peers on average across the country. So marriage and money go together like a horse and carriage for both men and women here in America today.
I love that. Now, I almost forgot to ask you about the stat that says 1 in 2 marriages end in divorce. Is that still true today? And for those of us who are married, what's some advice, some research-backed advice for making sure that we stay married?
Yeah, so that stat's no longer true. It used to be 1 in 2 in the 70s and 80s. It's come down. Divorce has come down since then. Probably closer to 40% of marriages today, first marriages, will end in divorce. And in terms of what can you do to kind of minimize risk of divorce, well, things like regular date nights, things like recognizing that your marriage matters for the welfare of your kids. Things like embracing fidelity, both kind of in theory, but also in practice. So like, being careful when you're traveling for work or when you're online. People can get into trouble, obviously, these days when they do things like, when they're 1,000 or 2,000 miles from their spouse or when they're kind of immersed in the electronic rabbit hole. We know, too, that men's stable employment is a major predictor of marital stability. So if you're a husband, being intentional about your work and not, sometimes obviously people are fired for no, reason that was related to their own work. But there are some guys who are not very intentional about being reliable employees. And so that's a big issue when it comes to divorce. And the final piece is just, again, community. And couples who are embedded in a church community or in some kind of synagogue or temple, for instance, are more likely to avoid divorce court because they're surrounded by people who tend to prioritize marriage and family and act accordingly.
That's great. Thank you so much for that. Okay, a couple of fun questions. What about a song that you have on repeat right now?
So a song that I have on repeat right now is called Family Best Is Yet to Come by Judah and the Lion.
Oh, I've not heard that one. I'll put it on my
they've got a lot
list.
of good songs.
Yeah.
It's a relatively, I think, new band, but that's on my playlist right now.
That's great. What about a book that you've been recommending to others that you enjoy?
So, one book that I think is very helpful is actually just above me, and it's called The Power of Commitment by Scott Stanley. It's a great book that kind of gives a very accessible take on how to forge a committed marriage today.
The Power of Commitment, you said?
Yes, by Scott Stanley.
That's great. Thank you so much for joining the show. Tell everyone where they can find you.
So bradwilcox.com is one place to find me, and then also familystudies.org is a think tank with which I'm affiliated.
That's great. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Okay, thanks, Allie.
So fascinating to think about what the data shows, right? For a lot of us, it's not surprising. I think for huge segments of society, it's going to be really surprising. Be sure to share this one on social media. You can share on an Instagram story. You can subscribe on YouTube and like it and leave a comment, and you'll be entered to win a copy of the book. I'm giving out 5 copies of the book. So share away or comment away on YouTube, and I will pick the winners. Okay, let's move on to coaching segment. Today is all about how to make progress. Now, it can be making progress in anything that you want. First off, I want you to think about something that you want to do. This could be something big, it could be something small, something that you want to begin, or just something that you want to make progress with. I want you to ask yourself, what's one tiny action that you can decide that you're going to tackle right now, today? Take a minute to think about it, because even the smallest step forward can lead to big changes down the road. Often we find ourselves waiting for the perfect moment when we have all the information that we need to make a decision, right? If we just had clarity, if I just had more details, it would be okay. But when we're being honest, that moment almost never comes on its own without us taking action. In reality, waiting for complete clarity is just an excuse to avoid doing something that makes us feel uncomfortable or makes us feel like something might not be successful, or we might embarrass ourselves, or we might waste our time, whatever the issue is for you. So I want you to ask yourself, who is someone that I could reach out to with a quick call or an email, right? Just to get some information, just to get some insights, just to help you kind of move closer to the information that you need to help you take action to move closer to that goal, right? Sometimes it takes an email. Sometimes it's coffee with somebody. Sometimes it's a phone call. It's whatever you want it to be. Now, the next step is we dive deeper into understanding what you not taking action is costing you. And you might say, well, it's not costing me anything. I'm not doing anything. But everything has a cost. This is really important to fully understand because the price of staying in your current situation might be higher than you realize. I remember when I told a friend that the Lord had been telling me for years to take 2 hours a day as investment time, as learning time and prayer time, of course, but exercise and making sure I was learning things, making sure I was growing. I'll tell you who it is. It was with Joe Saxton. And Joe said to me one day, is it clear yet what it has cost you not to do that? Because I was always full of excuses why I didn't have 2 hours a day, right, to do all these things. And I put it on an index card and I put it up in my office. And it still took me another 2 or 3 years to make sure that I really invested that time. But I looked at that question all the time. Is it clear yet what it has cost you? And to some degree it hadn't. And it wasn't until it became really clear that I realized, okay, it was time to get going. So some questions you can ask yourself are there opportunities that you're missing out on because you haven't taken action? Are there opportunities, things that you want to do that you can't because you haven't taken action? Are there dreams that you're putting on hold? It's key to ask yourself these questions head on. Seriously. In terms of starting a business or creating a course or doing something new, I'll tell you a story from my life. Years ago when I was building my business, a mentor said, why aren't you taking action on this thing I wanted to do? It's part of my business. And I said, I made all the excuses. I'm not quite sure how. I don't have the time. What if it doesn't work? And she said, do you know how much you would like to make by doing this? And I said, yeah, it was the amount for us to go on a family vacation every year. And she said, it's actually costing you that much money to not do this. And I went, oh, that is a great way of looking at it. She said, you're just losing that amount of money every year. I want you to go build it, and I want you to do it. And that was such a game changer for me. So for you, I want you to make kind of this topic that we're talking about real. I want you to write down what you're missing out on by not taking action. Sometimes seeing it on paper can make it more real to us. I want you to really understand what the cost that you are already paying actually is. And let that be a motivation to help you make change and take action. Now, as an action step today, I want you to commit to reaching out to one person who can provide you with information or insight. It could be a mentor, it could be a colleague, it can be a coach, or it can be a friend who has a bunch of knowledge in the area that you're curious about. But don't let lack of information and lack of knowledge keep you stuck. I want you to draft that email or plan a call with them now, today. Set a deadline for yourself to do this within the next 24 hours max, especially if you're driving down the road. Just make sure you do it. I want you to schedule an appointment on your calendar to make sure you actually get it done. Because this commitment, even though it's small, is a concrete step toward breaking the cycle of being stuck and starting momentum that you need to reach your goal. This is how you do it. You find out what it's costing you. You find out what you're missing out on now, and you let that drive you. And you just take a little step to gathering some information. Because as the Lord nudges us in certain directions and kind of gives us a vision or gives us a desire in our heart to achieve something, the more we take steps in that direction, the more He will give us insight. He will bring people to us, and the people that He brings to us will invest in us. And sometimes that investment is just a quick 10-minute conversation where you go, oh, that's all it is. I get it. So don't let yourself stay stuck because you don't know. Plan to have a phone call, send an email, find out the information that you're looking for. Okay, now let's talk about recommendations. Speaking of little things, my recommendation falls right in line. So, of course, one of my big mantras is small changes, big results. And how important it is to look for the tiny little changes in life that we can make to make life easier, that are going to make life more successful, that basically help us put our life on easy mode. One of my favorite life hacks is to find the points of the day where I'm annoyed by something or where there's a little bit of friction or stress. And then I try to find a very simple solution for it. So anytime there's friction, I go, how can I just fix this? Fix that little bit of stress and remove it from my day. As you know, I live with about 1,000,000 people. That's a ton of cooking. Whether it's dinner or someone's measuring spoonfuls to measure out their protein powder or sugar or oatmeal in the morning, whatever it is, we're always using tablespoon measurements. I would open a drawer in our kitchen and we never had a tablespoon measuring spoon ready for me to use. They were always dirty. And it annoyed me every time. We had 3, but they were either in the sink or they were in the dishwasher. Somebody in the house had just used them. So going back to my mantra of small changes, big results, combined with the life hack of removing small annoyances from life, I went to Amazon and bought a package of 5 tablespoon measuring spoons. Less than $15. I think it was $12.99. And it has changed my life. I am no longer grumpy when I go in the kitchen and I open the drawer because I need to measure out my cottage cheese that I'm putting out on something or how much fiber I'm putting in a drink. I sound very 47 when I talk about fiber, but if you heard the fiber recommendation, it's very important. Now, the thing about the tablespoon is it's a little thing for sure, but I would find myself every day getting annoyed, depending on what I was cooking every day, 2 or 3 times a day. And I think that we need to think about the things in our life, those little things that annoy us throughout the day, because they really do add up. So your action step and your challenge this week, if you choose to accept it, is just to observe yourself in a non-judgmental way and go through your day-to-day life and look for the little things that annoy you, right? Even those things that you think they're too small to waste your time thinking about it, and then just fix them. Taking away a lot of little annoyances really does lead to a better mood all day long. Now, and if you're like me and you need a bunch of tablespoon measuring spoons, I will put a link in the show notes, of course. I'm here to help. And I am here because you're here. I love that we get this time together every week because it's an investment. It's an investment in me, what I'm learning with these conversations on the show. It's an investment in you with what you're learning, because your emotional health, your professional success, your spiritual health, it benefits everyone around you. That's why you're here every week, learning something small that's going to help you do what God is calling you to do, just little by little, every single day. Because what I know to be true is that God has created you to stand strong and bring something special and unique to this world that only you can bring. So keep stepping up, keep showing up, and keep loving well, because you know the truth. You can't break a woman who gets her strength from God. I love to get to coach and equip you every week. I'll be back with you next Monday, and I hope you have a great day. What am I talking about? Fluffy? Too fluffy? I don't know. That was a rough transition. Let's try that again. And cut.